Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 25th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Positive Theory is Impossible. The text follows. With materials of this kind, we can only say to ourselves that it is a sheer impossibility to construct for the art of war a theory which, like a scaffolding, shall ensure to the chief actor an external support on all sides. In all those cases in which he is thrown up upon his talent, he would find himself away from scaffolding of theory and in opposition to it, and however many-sided it might be framed, the same result would ensue of which we spoke when we said that talent and genius act beyond the law, and theory is an opposition to reality. So in this paragraph, von Clausewitz reaches the conclusion that positive theory is impossible, as the title says. And as short as this paragraph is, actually it is very significant, because in here von Clausewitz expresses very heavy statements, at least given the ultimate conclusions, right? That show substantially the impossibility of positive theory that we have seen, of course, throughout all the paragraphs that have led us here. These characteristics, especially these peculiarities that we have enumerated, the peculiarity of mind entailing these three specialties, essentially the first one being moral forces and their effects, that is the hostile feeling, then the second, living reaction, and the third, the uncertainty of all data, right? So if you have, I always remind you that in order to understand von Clausewitz, you can't extrapolate this single maxims and statements like without perspective, without depth, which is what it happens dramatically often in popular culture. Of course, for the sake of convenience, we kind of make one video for each paragraph so that it's ordered kind of linear, in the same way von Clausewitz has conceived the work, but it's still a work that requires constantly the reader, the student better, to remind of all where von Clausewitz comes from in this sense. So that's the way I make a series, right? And I don't jump from here and there, but I'm going like with a list, because this is a wall system, right? It's not a series of scattered information. This is a big structure that has to be deciphered, eliminated, and in itself, actually, it's very simple, right? It's the let's say. Overall, the structure is complex, but the ultimate meaning really is really looking at a general principle and then at all its branches, right? And the contents of the single paragraphs are actually quite easy to understand, right? If one has the patience to read them and to really grasp what they mean, not just wishing to have understood them and then passing to the next paragraph. No, that's why it requires studying, not just reading. But anyhow, it's still fundamental here to bear in mind the ultimate objective of this part of the work. That is to say, okay, we can't have a positive theory of the art of war. That is, in other terms, we can't have a set of rules that can be applicated successfully for the sake of for what is going to follow in action, with the aim of success, because of these factors that we have listed, right? That there is a dimension of warfare that basically stems from feelings, right? That's the first specialty, this hostile feeling. How can you measure that? I mean, you can, that's what von Clausewitz tells us, but that requires an art, a perspective, a sensitivity, an experience, right? And you can't measure a feeling, right? There is no unit of measure for that. And all the consequences. Secondly, the fact that you're actually fighting not against, you know, and this is the second peculiarity, living reaction, right? You're fighting against not an object that you can just passively expose to your action, so you can't guide it, as if that was the standard thing. Just look at the object and then attack it. No, you're always fighting against someone who is reacting, right? And is reacting also naturally on the base of moral forces. Always remember that for von Clausewitz, the clash, war is effectively, first and foremost, a clash between moral forces, and that's deep, right? Not because material elements do not matter, right? But scientifically speaking, the approach that we have towards matter, like with physics, etc., cannot be applied to war largely, right? Because still instruments are like the material dimension is still operated in some way, or at least interacting with a living reaction that is that evolves, that is capable of changing even this very world we live in, right? So you don't know what the enemy is thinking. Also, you're not from the other side. I mean, even if you were to know that, still that person could produce another idea, and then it is striking back in a different way. And the third element, of course, the uncertainty of all data. That means that most of the times, not just dramatically few about what's going on, but also what you know is fundamentally susceptible of change, right? Knowledge by itself is not really a clear knowledge, right? Our senses and our intellect does not look at the world and simply applicate mathematical notions to it. And thank God for that, because in that case we would be incapable of using this great gift of ours, that is our mind, that is able to make us understand certain things without even rationalizing them. Which doesn't mean just being reliant over feelings, but really having a kind of effect of an art, right? An art that definitely is tied to the feelings, but it's not all about feelings. It's also mechanical, right? It's also practical, and tells us, and many times with an incredible capacity of synthesis from our mind side, what's going on. And at the point it can be more useful even than a proper scientific inquiry, right? These statements are dangerous because they can be equivocated. It's not that the scientific aspect doesn't come into place, because also the art requires science, and science, in order to be applied, requires art. But what it means here is that most of the times you don't have, it's pointless in every moment of our life to constantly measure things mathematically. We don't live like that. You don't calculate how much water you want when you're filling the glass, even if there is a mathematical principle in the dimension of the glass, but your brain is saying, okay, I want more water, less water. You don't even calculate that. You just orientate yourself more or less, right? And how do you explain that? Can you frame that on an equation paper that actually is applicable in reality? No, and there is not even need for that, right? This is what von Clausewitz says, in fact, also very powerfully in this very paragraph. That is, we can do not only we can most of the times do without that, and we must do without that because we are obliged by the circumstances, exactly by this constant ignorance that revolves, that we have about most of the things. Like von Clausewitz at one point says that three-fourths of the whole picture at all times, but also we should go even against it in some moments. Or better, we should go against what seems manualistically wrong, but in practice can change because of many circumstances, right? And that's a powerful statement, in my opinion, because it gives an astonishingly high responsibility to free will, right? And obviously of criticism and intellectual capacities. This is not so. It has enormous, even ethical implications in here. Von Clausewitz had experienced what war was at from the lowest to the highest levels of the chain of command, in first person, and he comes up for most of his life, and what he comes up here with is, and which will be at the base, believe me, on the doctrine, even in countries like, if you wonder why Prussia won over France in 1870, it's largely because there was this confidence that the Clausewitzian thought had left towards, for example, the individual initiative of officers. And this is something that lasted on. It even had, he was one of the factors that created Blitzkrieg at one point, in the 20s of the 20th century. So it's very important because it doesn't. It's a broader philosophical statement. It's not confined, and it had a great impact in the history of at least of of course of the military thought, but at that point, as you understand, of a lot of other things in the world, right? And always remember that, aside from the ugliness of such ideologies, but some of the most successful wars in terms of even fought by, won by, I don't know, think about the Russian Civil War. Lenin was like a Clausewitzian, for example, and he won in this desperate situation. I mean, the fact that the Bolsheviks came to power at one point during the Russian Civil War was, unthinkable at the beginning. Well, Lenin respected much of what Clausewitz was indicating here. The same Germans, both like in World War the First and World War the Second, they were thinking largely on the base of von Clausewitz, also misinterpreting him, whatever. But this always happens. I mean, von Clausewitz became, in this sense, a tool for lots of powers to achieve their their goals. And we can say, oh well, that's kind of negative. Well, by saying this, of course, you don't understand what he said, but it actually proves von Clausewitz right, because, as we know, war is just persecution of politics by other means. So it doesn't matter who enacts that policy for that whatever political reason, but that's how it works, and how it's seen clearly. I mean, even democracy is being exported thanks to von Clausewitz, and many positive things have been achieved, and von Clausewitz is at this point universally at the base of the doctrine of the military theory of all the armed forces in the world. I think I don't know any country that kind of came from other, but this being worldwide. So, and nobody has proven him wrong. I mean, this is also what I like to recall, that albeit there's been criticism towards von Clausewitz and a lot of blah 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 and talk whatever, but von Clausewitz is still there. It still has that role in all the world's militaries and military thought, and nobody has ever surpassed it. So it's just like waves crashing over a rock, and not really changing much at the end of the day. So the point here is also to realize the impact of this very foundation. That and I stress this, why? Because the general understanding today of war, I would say in popular culture, whatever, is still based instead on the opposite of what von Clausewitz explained, right? We fall all the times, even certain Clausewitzians that eventually haven't studied von Clausewitz for real, they look at this figure and essentially thinking that there is it's all about a physical dimension, that in spite of what in spite of what they presume to have learned about von Clausewitz, they still think it's still about material things. They can't find in war like a manual guide where to operate. There are certain countries, especially, who are obsessed about recovering von Clausewitz, making unlikely parallelisms between him and Sun Tzu, it is like comparing Hegel to Pythagoras, having it more than 2,000 years of history separating from each other. So it's there are these intellectual traps that are actually pretty stupid. I mean, they're not very seducing either, I must tell you, but that people like to fall into constantly, right? Many people just even put everything into a cauldron, like von Clausewitz, Keegan, a little hard, and they believe that they're actually it's all about war, right? It's right. They don't even know that those two were criticized. What is culturalism, for example? What they think about von Clausewitz. So my advice is always to, never think that you actually can have a clear idea of things until you don't learn something about them for real. And it tells us chiefly about a lot of intellectual laziness that we all have, and that also von Clausewitz recognizes, because if you remember one of our videos, von Clausewitz says exactly this, that humans tend to reject difficulties, right? So as much as they can, to avoid them, at least if they can. And if they were left alone without pressure, they would die of kind of, apathy at that point, and we would be extinct. Sorry. So even our sufferance and violence, it's actually what civilization is built upon, and that's also why war is so meaningful, because it presents some of the high, the most emergential and difficult and tough situations you can ever think of, also at a social level, that is not just at an individual level, and makes you and teaches you very clearly what the relations, in fact, between humans in this, the dimension of politics, war, and society actually work, right? Because they're the moment in which they're emerging more clearly, but in a kind of much clearer picture. So that's also why studying war is important, right? The more I study military history, and the more I'm convinced that it's actually not like the other subjects. Like, military history is probably the largest social science, because it actually entails the knowledge of too many things. Like, military history is not just about, as many people think, maybe military technology, which is actually one of the least important things overall. Like, it can be also about, like, it's about a lot of things, right? It's about, in fact, understanding the very connection that exists between the military action and the political will and the social and society in itself. And I know that it sounds like, oh yeah, the usual story of the new military history, right? It's not, war is not important, you just have to study politics and society. It's not that either, because frankly I'm writing a work right now that is exactly the same, very opposite, in which I state pretty clearly that we shouldn't study war just for understanding politics and society. Yeah, of course, that can be maybe the most useful thing, but that war has a dimension in its own that deserves as much as attention as the one of politics and society, right? So that you can't separate them, but pretending to call yourself a military historian, not even knowing how an army operates on the field, it's like you're not a military historian. You're yeah, I mean, in part, you can't call yourself. I don't want to say there are people who have written brilliant stuff, but it's still like studying how a car is made and not knowing how to drive it. Right? It doesn't make sense. Like, even if it was just a theoretical thing, because I don't wage war either. I'm not a military commander, but I do study how that was done, and that's quite important, right? So. And von Clausewitz is the first one that, not just as a general, but also as a military historian, actually recognizes the radical importance of military history in order to complete the very, the art of war in practice, and how doctrine is important in that sense, because a good commander is. A better commander is he who has led an army, actually. But the best commander is the one who has led an army and also studied military history, right? Never forget about it, and we will get to that point in the Vom Kriege where he actually explains this. So, for who has followed the series here, up to this point, knows that, of course, we have up to this point seemingly just set the ground for explaining von Clausewitz's theory. Eventually things get more complex, get more into the heat of action, we can say. So we are approaching there, and I think it's very thrilling. I don't know what you think about that, because nobody watches the series, but although there is not much to watch aside from von Clausewitz. Fascinating. For this picture you see all the time is actually it's of course him, and in the background you can see a book by Magdeburg, which is where he was born, right, in northeastern Germany, and today, and just for the record. And yeah, I know I could insert other pictures, but kind of lazy. I don't want to do it. And but that's what von Clausewitz was. But in fact, this should be mostly a listening exercise, rather, in hopefully also kind of a mental exercise and an intellectual exercise, hopefully most of all. So, but this theoretical base is fundamental, because really, if you don't understand this first part, you will keep making always the same mistake. I know the first time probably you read von Clausewitz says, okay, well, yes, this is just the beginning, it's a preparation for... No, that's actually the most important part. Like, the rest is kind of more interesting because it sounds more practical, right? So you fall once again into the trap that the most interesting thing is learning how to do it, right? Learning how to become a strategist, like understanding all war, having all the best tactical solutions. No, that's, of course, von Clausewitz helps you throughout the whole work with that, and there are objectively, yes, of course, certain dynamics that von Clausewitz talks about strategy and tactics that are fundamental in order to learn those fields, let's say. But still, the best exercise you can do is to study military history. That's the best thing you can do in order to, and I mean studying it for real, like taking all the sources and trying to figure out things, which is very difficult, right? And it teaches you how complicated even talking about war is, which is constantly forgotten. Seems to be like, I don't know even how to say this, but nobody does it. Like, it's astonishing how there is objectively a great interest towards these topics worldwide, but when it comes to find someone who actually studied these things for real, from sources, not just reading books about it, of course, can be a start. But it's very rare to find someone, right? And even rarer, I would say, is finding someone who is actually interested into the art of war as such. There is not simply military history, as we were saying before, right? So understanding history diachronically, not just being, a fan of, of the Romans or of the whatever period, and thinking, oh, that's all it matters. If you want to understand war, you have to study all of history, right? And you can, of course, in this sense, maybe even concentrate. It depends on what you have. Everything is useful, but the greatest benefit you can get is from a wider range of interests. Then, of course, for example, I confess that I don't know much about strategy. Like, I do understand certain things that I think are very important and are kind of basic, and you can't do without, right? But it's not that I have ever studied deeply, like, treatises about strategy and especially what other thinkers think. I'm much more about tactics, as I said many times, and I did study, like, most of my studies have been objectively about tactics, and all what I've written is about tactics up to now, and of course you can't do without, like, strategy is more important than tactics, and still they're so deeply intertwined that it doesn't even make sense to think otherwise. Like, just today I was reconstructing a battle, and I need to know the background, like strategic background, political background, because otherwise it's meaningless, right? But it is important to study campaigns and battles, right? And so in this sense, having a strategic and as well as tactical culture that is of dramatic importance. I don't know why I like tactics more, definitely because it's easier, possibly, but also because I like more the individual dimension. Maybe it's me, I don't know, I think I lean towards individualism even. I like even the psychology of warfare in throughout study of war. I like to, that if you follow me regularly, I've made all these videos about the the psyche, like the anthropology of war, in many ways. That is not like Keegan's like face of battle that everybody quotes, but something deeper that goes into the roots of culture, like in seeing how every culture kind of saw things its own from its own perspective, that is grounded, however, in reality that doesn't change, and observing how war, in fact, is always the same for real, right? And I don't know, that every time we talk about these topics, and I realize that there are 10,000 implications you can bring to on the table, but I think it's worth repeating these things because I don't know. I think I want to fascinate people who have maybe never thought about this stuff, which is not dramatically difficult to find, or not dramatically different to find, telling the truth, and especially making them understand that it's not just that war is not a sick or twisted interest. It's actually one of the deepest, most and highest and noblest interests you can have ever, right? It's not, studying war doesn't mean to be a militarist or a nationalist or a warmonger. It doesn't work like that. It's much deeper. It's actually all you need to know exactly to defeat those other perspectives, because if you reason in those perspectives way, you basically admit not to understand war for real. And the same goes for pacifism, or for lots of other everything ends in ism is actually not very healthy for someone's psyche, but it's von Clausewitz is a good cure. In fact, there is nothing like von Clausewitzianism like as such, and it's just and it stems from, in fact, what he writes without too many, actually without any form of subjectivity, if not maybe like, but still showing what it feels like to experience certain things, because at the end of the day it's still a universal and human-wide language that von Clausewitz is using here. So von Clausewitz in this paragraph starts by saying, okay, with materials of this kind we can only say to ourselves that it is a sheer impossibility to construct for the art of war a theory which, like a scaffolding, shall ensure to the chief actor an external support on all sides, right? So it's basically what we said before, right? You having seen these factors, basically it doesn't even make sense to pretend to find a manual that tells you what to do in every situation, because in war, like in life in general, it does not exist. And by stating this, there is nothing nihilistic, there is nothing negative, you're not denying anything. You're simply observing that when you have to act in reality, manuals do not work, and it's not the fault of who wrote the I mean, of course, who wrote the manual saw it wrong, but it's not because you should have a manual on your own, right? You can treat the Vom Kriege as a manual, but not in the sense of, that you will find the answers to the problems you will be faced with in reality. But just the general dynamic of how certain things work, so that when you observe them, you can recognize them and make a bit more of clarity, right? It's just a matter of orienting yourself in many ways, but then you have to solve the problem by yourself. And if you think about this, like, not like I can't think of any subject that doesn't have this approach of how eventually the profession is formed. Like, think about medicine. Doctors learn a lot of things, but every doctor will tell you that what matters the most is experience, because until you don't see how this extremely complex system actually works, you can't know how to do it, and still that will show you that kind of every organism, every person is different in its own regard. So you will most likely instead develop a different form of criticism. In fact, the same von Clausewitz actually uses the metaphor of the doctor, because he says, it's not just about a mechanism. This is not just like a machine. There is much more than that. There is a spiritual dimension as well. I mean, spiritual meaning moral, and how the organism reacts, etc. So everything is very, very, very uncertain, at the point that most of the times you don't know what most of things are like. And philosophically speaking, basically you don't understand anything for real. But just what that approximation that is useful for you to take action, which is not a guarantee for victory in war, but it is at least putting yourself on the right track to deal with the problem in a kind of a sensible fashion, right? So here, that's what he is actually talking about, and just stressing it further. Then he says, in all those cases in which he is thrown upon his talent, he would find himself away from this scaffolding of theory and in opposition to it. And however many-sided it might be framed, the same result would ensue of which we spoke when we said that talent and genius act beyond the law, and theory is in opposition to reality. Right? So here we have a lot of concepts, part of which, all of which we have already observed in other circumstances, in other paragraphs. So the first one is all these cases in which you strong oppose. Okay, so he's telling you what happens when you pretend to use this manual in reality. And what it happens is that this manual is always wrong. In the measure in which it tries to give you a help, is actually unhelpful, because it's trying to make you concentrate on certain aspects of the world picture that essentially distract you from what is really going on, and that you have your own capabilities to understand, right? And that you will remember, because this is also a serious business. So it's not just a matter of it comes instinctive, right? Even though for the same von Clausewitz, knowledge, that is scientific awareness, would be the single most important thing. Still, we are programmed, first of all, to get part of that, but also to absorb it and to stick it with us, right? It's like traumatic events. We tend to remember traumatic events. Why? Because we are meant to avoid them in the case, our mind gets impressed with them. So in the case they will happen again, and will, and we at that point we should mind that and trying to avoid them. And of course, traumatic events are also things that damage people at the point they can't cope with those problems kind of in a healthy way. But like it happens with all things. Like we all remember in our childhood, like an event that either scared us or it was new to us. At the point, it was a big surprise, and we remember that. And if you think about it, it's because you were feeling very strong emotions at that point. It can be also a positive event. It doesn't have to be a trauma. It was something negative, because our organism is made actually to learn from these very things. That's why this is important, even evolutionary speaking, if you think about it, because a light war is something that actually starts with civilization, in the sense that you can't talk about war for like hunters-gatherers, in the sense, but you can, you definitely can, but only from a certain time onwards, and it's actually a very complicated question to explain. I promise I will make a video about this one, because it's important to be expressed properly. But that's in fact what I'm saying. It's that the conflict has always been there, and conflict is what really polarizes your mind. It's the single most important thing. When you're in combat or you're in dangerous situations, you can see your mind is starting to work extremely faster than it would usually do. And you are not even doing that. Have you ever thought about it? I mean, if you're calm, you stay there, you feel lazy, and you want to take a nap, or going out for a walk, wherever, without being too worried about that, about anything. If something unexpected happens that is actually serious, and etc., your mind immediately, like, it's not that you're actually pushing yourself to it, it's that it comes immediate. It's incredible how much and the problem is we are with the bettering of our life quality, like the situations in which this most evident drama happens, is always less known to us, right? You need traumatic events or tragedies, or losses to make you realize how important certain aspects are. But since we live largely into a kind of a positive environment, well, that relaxes us. Well, I mean, in part, of course, not everything relaxes us, but let's say there are many things that also make you realize how this really is. But in general, let's say, abstractions from reality come from those contexts that are more extraneous to the heat of life, right? That's why, paradoxically, the everything in politics, in war, even in very faraway times, actually was much more understood than today. I believe, like, when I study about wars, about Middle Ages, thoroughly, especially from the contemporary sources, etc., you read many of them, the impression you get immediately is that these people were doing something that was so common, like they were used to do so often, like war, that even the degree of inefficiency was dramatically low, because everybody kind of knew how to do this stuff, and they kept doing it. And you realize that the sources were polarized by these events, especially those, of course, who took place in them. So it's as if our mind was concentrated constantly to this. So think about a fight. I don't know if you've ever been in a fight or in dangerous situations. You like this kind of tension for which you're polarized into what is going on. Like, it's attractive, it's fascinating. This is what we like about war, in fact, right? Is that people like war movies, like extremely peaceful people can, enjoy this stuff and say, because objectively very fascinating, and because it talks about kind of big deals, right? Great problems that take guts and mind to withstand. And that put to the test those who are involved, right? So that's where involved we like so much. Even this, we're fascinated, but something so terrible like war is, in fact, because it kind of, we're automatically attracted, at least, by those situations that can prove someone's competence. That is effectively what all society really needs, right? Not privileged parts, like, of groups that have to be artificially put in power because they need certain quotas on their own. No, we need exclusively competent people, and the rest matters exactly zero, right? There is no other way. Like that. That's how the whole civilization has developed, and only, in fact, certain imbeciles, like in the moment we live now, that are completely undetached with reality because they have it extremely easy, can't think that society and civilization shouldn't be about civilization, about competence, but about groups of certain character, right? That's anti-human, in my opinion. That's what we should fight against. And in my view, however, what von Clausewitz is talking about here is exactly the contrast that you get in this kind of situations with what the wishful thinking was. And you can relate to, like, for yourself. I mean, think about when you went to school, like you went to university, so you were old enough maybe to, or you went to work for the first time. You had all an idea about what it it could be like, right? And other people told you what it was, but you, after some years that you have done that, you would realize that what you thought you knew about that doesn't actually match reality, because you could have read so many manuals, but you realize that your experience, if you had to tell it in your own words, is completely different, or largely different at least, from what other people told you. Sorry. So that's that. Even if you're not exposed to particular pressure, never been to war, of course, which is very common, I would say, at least. You can relate in some measure what this perception of the difference between the positive theory and the practical art is, because you need to experience things firsthand in order to understand them, and in order for you to be solved, like it's complicated to say, but it essentially is what you can benefit from. And this is what the Vom Kriege is about. This is about getting actually useful information, not theoretical abstraction, because you think that you can extrapolate that from not having even dealt with these things firsthand. That's why military history is so important, because even if you don't go to war, fortunately, you can understand a lot even through that for real, which is a wholly different thing from saying, and this story is also more complicated, because actually not even war in itself teaches you many things at a certain level. Like, there are things that you can learn about war from a chair that maybe a common soldier back in the day didn't learn, and vice versa, of course, in the sense that, of course, you will never understand, and what, fortunately, and you should be always thankful there, what it means to be, in the bloody mud and under mortar fire in a minefield with limbs of people scattered around you, right? You will never understand that. But maybe you will understand what a strategy was about that soldier under mortar fire at that point was maybe part of, but that would never understand. I've read and watched and listened many stories about people who actually went to war, and sometimes when these people told you what it was like, but in terms of historical awareness, they were like zero. And this is very important, because that fits like with history overall. It's like understanding, having lived in a period actually doesn't mean that by itself to know what it was like. Like, there are certain things you will learn, but the broader picture, if you don't study that thoroughly, you will not get it. And this is not really a matter of approximation. It is literally as it is. And I realized that the majority of people are to the average level of saying, okay, I don't care, I don't want to learn, I have other things to think about. Yes, of course, but at that point you can't even pretend to actually understand what it was and lecturing others about it, as seemingly everybody can do, like about extremely complicated problems of political, international policy, in fact, of strategy. Everybody has seems to have an opinion, like, and they all sort everything out as if they were in the KGB in first person. Like, all the military analysts would just have to knock at their door, or write them on their Facebook account, and it's not like that. Nobody is actually like that. Just in order to understand a very limited strategic theater, let's say, what is happening in Libya right now, well, it takes years and years and years of study. How do you think you can have an easy answer for everything like world politics, or history, or war so easily, right? It doesn't work like that. In fact, I hope I don't give you that impression either, because sometimes I can be peremptory, because I know that even in terms of the audience does like people who speak directly, who actually seem to be opinionated, because there is I don't think I'm particularly charismatic at all, I'm telling you the truth, but you want to make them feel that like they're actually learning something sound, which is important for learning. Like, it's a very positive attitude, but still, paradoxically, and that's also what von Clausewitz philosophy is about, and not just von Clausewitz. That was also Popper's one, for example. Some of the greatest thinkers and philosopher, not Popper, maybe no, not Popper. I don't remember. But what was the however, the concept that fundamentally the greatest progress you can make is through a failure. And this is what it is, and that's what von Clausewitz is making here, that the greatest progress that in practice, even if he never says that because he was intelligent, modest, and honest enough not to do it, is that he wrote this stuff actually because of the failure of lots of other people who tried to create a positive theory which actually can't be done. Like, you can do it, but as he said now, just in this phrase, you would fall out of reality. Like, you would find yourself into trouble, right? And of course there are different levels of this about this awareness as well, because it's like and that von Clausewitz is perfectly aware of, and you know it if you have followed the last paragraphs, is that of course there is it's like the example of the soldier and the one of the general. Like, there is an abyss between the perception of the two, what the whole thing is about. So this doesn't mean that just by being, as we were saying before, just by being into something makes you also a genius about that and an expert about that. It's not that either, but it can show you pretty easily how practicality is more important than wishful thinking, right? And that's and theoretical thinking in general, right? Or better, let's say something more sound. Let's say that that abstractions do not pay well. Like, it's like with war games, right? There are excellent war games, but there's still an approximation of reality, and the same concept of the war game in itself is just shifting like the level of approximation, but not saying, okay, let's deny the approximation. Of course they know it's approximated, but still there are certain fanatics of it. And by war games here I mean, like, it can be everything literally in terms of simulative intention, that is saying, okay, maybe that get more concerned about the details and the rules of this, and they lose track of the fact that the system in itself is flawed because it can't work just by a set of approximations, right? Can be more or less close to reality, but it's still not reality, and it will never be. And reality doesn't pass by setting a rule that becomes a law that never changes, right? And that's what von Clausewitz is talking about here, because he said that first of all, he said this astonishing thing is that not only you can't you couldn't have a practical use of a positive theory, but you most of the times have to act even in opposition. I mean, most of the time, in many situations you will even have to act in opposition to it, right? And however many-sided it might be framed, the same result would ensue, of which we spoke when we said that talent and genius act beyond the law, and theory is an opposition to reality. So it doesn't matter how this theory is complex, still positive theory, as we have defined, is in opposition to reality. Is in opposition. It's not just the whole set of approximation is so astray from reality that becomes in terms of purpose as opposite. You're trying to sort something out. What you're actually doing instead is forcing an interpretation that distorts reality for the sake of your own, I don't know, ego or intellectual pride or whatever. And it's extremely common. You find it everywhere all the time, simply because everybody wants to be right. Everybody wants to find a simple answer for complex topics. It happens all the time. We do it all the time. I do it all the time. You do it all the time. There is just a difference between who does it kind of being more aware about the complexity of reality, so that acting more cautiously and therefore usually getting the best results, and would just want to be a rush and say, okay, here I have to show off and pretending I have the answer. And it happens all the times, right? I could make many examples. I'm waiting for making that discussion, Facebook discussions video because some are pretty dumb, right? But they're not dumb because and that's very fascinating. When you actually get past them, you look at them in perspective, and you realize that, I mean, from their point of view, they were right, and probably they don't have the awareness that they are wrong, because that's the real tragedy of the whole story. And that's why you should always be learning and studying every day, all the time, because it's, I mean, all the time, maybe not, because you have to do something else, but learning something new every day, because as long as you do that, you can deepen much you can discover things you didn't know, which seems like banal to say, but it's actually not, because you see, until you don't know them, you also don't realize how that thing was there. So if you were to reason about something that required that knowledge, you would get that knowledge wrong, because you don't have that specific information. And it happens constantly, and that's a common existential state of humanity. Like we all live like this. It's not really a matter of personal impression or whatever. It's really a problem we constantly face, and most of actual history meant as research, etymologically speaking, is exactly this: is expanding your knowledge into fields that it's not that what people in the past wrote was actually wrong because they mistook, I don't know, they miscopied a text. But simply because they judged that text on the basis of things that now are coupled, like with lots of other information that is necessary to be added to it, to have a deeper vision, and that's also where ideologies stem from. I mean, how complex, apparently, complex, let's say, and apparently complicated the world is, because of different bias, of different inclinations that we can have when we think about the stories, and when we I don't even know how to say this, but we tend to also we try to rationalize sometimes the picture, right? That's also another, let's say, I don't even know how to qualify this either. Like, if it's a problem, it's a sin, like, in part. The idea that everything has to make sense forcefully on the basis of information that we may not know. Instead, we do it constantly, and even understanding each other is dramatically difficult. But we try not to, to realize that most of these difficulties actually stem from ignorance from our own side. And it's tough to admit. Like, it's one of the most difficult things to say. Not much like I was wrong. Like, that's more like a consequence, but I didn't know that. Because it entails that when you came out with an opinion, that opinion is invalid because you hadn't known the thing. So even if probably there is less ego attached to that, still faking. How do you think scholars, like people who study a lot, actually reason? Like, do you think they're enlightened minds? Because when I was younger and I didn't know so many things, I thought, like, the history professors, these people will be so smart, they know everything, who knows which mind they have. Actually, I underestimated them under certain points of view, but I dramatically overestimated them on the other point of view. I usually underestimated them in terms of the actual complexity of their knowledge about their topic, like, because I also knew less about the specific topic, and that's the trick, in fact. But in parallel, also with them, like, I overestimated the fact that they knew more than much in sheer quantitative terms, and that and I also thought that they were dramatically smart. Instead, sometimes it's just an art of tricks to sound like as if you knew something, but you actually don't. Maybe even just at the moment, and that you can even turn in a sort of advantage, like as if you could be more mysterious, like you say, no, we have to talk about this thing at one point, even if you actually don't know what you're talking about. And we all do it. It's just, and especially about entertainers and disclosures and people who make education, etc. This is very often, this is very frequent, and most of the times it's even about acting. For example, I'm not capable of acting more than much. Like, I can make you think that maybe I know something that I really don't know at some points, or that I don't have this dramatic competence in. But I usually don't. The things I say, let's put it in this way, are things that I kind of tested on my own already. It's not about presenting. Many people try to sell them. The problem of culture education today is this one. People do it for money. They don't do it because they're lucky and they can do it freely, like I do, for example. Even though, yeah, I still get paid for what I do. Not here, I mean, but for studying history. I would do it even if I wouldn't be paid. That's the interesting thing. Instead, there's plenty of people who were kind of, doing just for the money. And that is a problem, because I've met actually very good historians that were so desperate that they started kind of writing for entertainment. And they were obviously dumbing down and sometimes even lowering dramatically the same quality of their historical inquiries for sparing two people who were too dumb, in fact, or too ignorant, or both, let's say, to understand that that work was not maybe extremely refined. While when they wrote, actually, these scholars wrote actual scientific works, they were actually pretty good, right? And you can see the difference in potential at that point. And you can understand how many tricks are used even in publishing, in people who write, because it's important, and especially in spoken. When we see all these people make conferences, etc., they seem that they know everything. They're so special, but in my opinion, there are many actors, right? They are actors in many ways, and I have difficulties to, sometimes even expressing myself. For example, that is a problem, because I couldn't do that. Like, I started Schwerpunkt, but of course we talk here in quite formal terms. But when you have to speak at a conference, I did it a couple of times. It's not about things I wrote, by the way, because that's the point. So you're expected a certain degree of competence. It's not easy. Like, and especially the most difficult thing is making people understanding the complexity of what you do or say, and even maybe because you don't have time. Like, if you have to explain something in 20 minutes, and it's actually a very complex thing, and the people who are listening don't even know what you're talking about, it's a challenge, because you have to spend at least 10 minutes, which are not sufficient to make them understand a context which they usually don't understand. So at that point, maybe they don't, and maybe it's your fault that you can't equilibrate the two things. But hey, it's their problem. Maybe you know much more than them. At the point, you shouldn't even be explaining what you said, and just publishing. So, but this also opens another parenthesis about call for papers and all these conferences that are actually and drastically bringing down the quality of scientific publications worldwide. like it's disgusting. Sometimes certain papers that are published just for the sake of money, mostly of universities, because the historians don't get any money, but just they get the mention, they get the article. So someone writes them, there's a bibliography somewhere with their name, like so, or better, that they can present a curriculum with something published. That's utterly disgusting, because the quality, renowningly, the quality of current academic papers is disgusting. For this very reason, because it's a market. There are not people freely doing it for passion and talent and competence. It's just a bunch of people who starve, because they don't have money, and that's it. That's exactly it. So I promise I will make lots of other videos about this topic specifically, because it's so true, and I realize that many of you like even this kind of dark scenarios about such topics, like saying what are the limits of learning, like how do people know things, why are they competent, what's the trick behind it, because we all would like to improve, right? So I think it's interesting. I will discuss it. So another thing that, however, coming back to Von Clausewitz, we were saying here is quite simply that talent and genius act beyond the law, right? So this is important that Von Clausewitz uses these terms, because talent and genius are these. Talent is this ability, genius is more this intellective ability, capacity. It's between art and mind, but kind of in a synthesis that act beyond the law, right? That is not rule, but a law. So the law, that the difference between law and rule is that the law can't be changed, right? The rule can. So Wu pretends to set a law for which this is its point, therefore you have to obey it in every circumstances, is actually unrealistic, right? Because literally everything can be questioned at some point, at some level, and especially in the concrete application that you can make of it. That's possibly the single most important thing, because that's what we essentially search for when we look at this world. So I pretend that I would say, and we can maybe expand this topic, that but you understand the general meaning of it. Like, it's about genius, it's about talent, it's about things that sometimes we have the difficulty to express, right? Unfortunately, in this world, we believe that, everybody has an hidden talent, right? And most of the times, people don't. Let's be honest, which doesn't even mean you can't be successful. It's not that, being successful is just like being a genius or a talent. Most of the time, it's actually not even true, right? So it's not a big deal. But people like not just to be successful, but kind of being appreciated for themselves. Like, I'm so talented, I'm so intelligent, I'm so genial, have all this story, my story is so special, everything is special. When you meet these people, usually because they have a very low self-esteem, and they have to, let's say, presume that they have some inherent special quality, right? But on the other hand, there is a lot of incomprehension. These are things maybe I talked about in that video about communication, but I think I didn't dip in it. Maybe here it's not necessary to expand it, from Clausewitz's video. But I mean, since Von Clausewitz himself is talking about it, the concept of misunderstanding when it comes to the effective capacities of some. We always misjudge people, let's be honest about that. We're not easily impressed by people, we're always distrustful, we don't like others' success in general, not because necessarily we are jealous about it, but rather because we think that that person is an imposter and just not qualified, something like that. But there is also more than that. It's really about you being misunderstood. Like when you have actually a good idea and you know that it's good because your guts tell you that it is. Well, you should listen to your guts. This is what von Clausewitz here is talking. Believe it or not, actually, you should follow your intuition. Like I can't say now. I'm like I don't know how I'm even making these videos given all the stuff I have to do. But right now I've come to make a huge work for my research that at the beginning made me feel like I was not qualified, like, I can't do this, it's too much, I don't know enough. Like, you need luck. This is also what von Clausewitz teaches you, that sometimes there are encounters, there are discoveries that change entirely the course of a particular action, right? Sometimes there is, but that throughout all the adversities, all the problems, all the setbacks, there is one thing that I increased over time. It was my self-confidence, because I discovered that my initial intuitions were always right. Right? Those specific intuitions, at least I can't say that this is true for everything, but the impressions I got actually at the beginning were more useful to me than having this preset theoretical scientific abstraction of what I had to do. And of course I needed a lot of pressure and like crashing against a lot of problems in order to find what the best way was, and there was no way out of that. Never think it's easy or that you can easily learn things easily. This is also an enormous prejudice about current affairs. Like, everybody thinks they can get it easily done, to be smarter than others. No, every person who has a minimal intelligence knows that life is objectively about suffering, is objectively about a lot of unjust things happening, and about a lot of things that bother you immensely and you have to do anyway because otherwise you can't progress. This is literally life in a nutshell. There's no real positive light into these specific things, if not for the consequence, the outcome of this, because the more you get through these problems, the better you get. And sometimes you have nothing but the belief in yourself and in your intuition, your capacities. And this is what von Clausewitz is stressing here, is that sometimes you have to have the courage to take a leap of faith, to say, okay, I don't know how to do this, but I will try to do it anyway, because I know that deep inside I have found something important and I want it to be brought forward, right? And when the premises are those, I can't say that it's always going to be a success, because it would be false, but it's really, that's where usually the best outcome statistically occurs, because it's not driven by someone else telling what to do mechanically and following up those instructions, but it's you bringing forward, in fact, a moral force, a spiritual force. That's what it is, and that's what von Clausewitz is talking about. And that's what the whole fight is about. And that's the one that also wavers more because, when you fail, you feel the setbacks, you do feel that. It's as if, your moral can completely flip, and not just because you feel kind of sad or happy, but you can't see your future picture in a completely different fashion. You can lose heart, you can stop believing, but it's just a mind trick, and you have to react to that. And life will make you react to that, because you realize at one point that giving up is not worth it. Like, it's better to make a disaster, but at least doing it for your own decision, that and having given your best, right? Because you know that you have given your best, then achieve a success by someone else's instruction. Just, that's powerful, and that's what all truly matters in the end. Like, if you think about it, I presume that's the single most important thing in the whole picture, and for your own improvement, like for your own feeling of, for your own realization as an individual, I would say. So yeah, all right. So we can stop here. Actually, the thing was, the paragraph was just 2 phrases long. I add a lot because I like to discuss all the implications that can, as I was saying before, getting people closer to these topics. And yeah, this is pretty much it. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.